fine. We're about to get started. Just grab a seat. The first day is always a little chaotic, but it's all good. We've got some faces I haven't seen in a while. Yay! We've got some new faces. I'm so excited to dive into this. And I just want to welcome everybody. Did everybody get a book so far? Yeah, it's self-serve back there. Yes, we're going to that kind of, yes. I'm getting smarter in my old age. I'm getting smarter. Good morning, Pam. You made it on. Good job. Good job. No coffee or snacks. No, I don't want to. Come on in, Mary. Come on, find a seat. The books are self-serve at the back. And we're going to go ahead and get started because we have so much to cover, and it's just so crazy because buckle your seatbelts, everyone. This, if it feels like we're going to move fast today, this is the slow day. Like, I'm going to start you off slow. We're only going to go from like Abraham to David today. Come on in, Jennifer. I know, that's all. Just wait. So, just wait. Is there enough space? Oh yeah, you can sit by your husband on the corner.
Isn't this nice that you have to worry about enough space?
I know, it is nice that we have to worry about enough space. So
I think it's fabulous.
I think it's fabulous also. I'm going to go ahead and pray for us this morning, and we're going to get started. And for those that are attending in class, on the first day of class, I try to save a few moments at the end to do some introductions, but I don't take 20 minutes to get started to do introductions because it slows down those who are watching online, okay? So, and as much as you probably all want to know who all's here, when they can't see faces, it's just a little bit of a boring dialogue sometimes when you don't see. Come on in, Kathy, and grab a seat, and there's seats to pull up to the chairs if you need one, so I know.
Are we on mic?
Yes, I'm trying something new for our online community to amplify the voices a little bit more. So we'll have to see if it works out. So, all right, let's pray and get started. Holy Father, thank you so much for just the opportunity to be in your house this morning. Thank you for this group that has gathered. And we gather as pilgrims on a journey, Lord. We come here wanting to learn. And we want to learn about your people and learn about history. But most important, Lord, we want to learn, so what? What is in this book and what is in this story that matters to my life and brings hope and healing and transformation and connection? And so I just pray, God, that even though we're going to be talking about just past events and people and dates and all kinds of things like that, that through it, Lord, we can just really feel your presence and feel our place in the story. And so we just lift that hope up to you this morning, God. And again, thank you for the opportunity to gather and to celebrate your word and just the message that it continually has for us, for me, of just your relentless pursuit of me and your redemptive power at work in my life, God. And so we just lift that up as our hope and prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay. Yes. Yes. Back table, self-serve. Help yourself at the back table. There's the books. Yep. Yep. Nope. There's a bag right there on the back, honey. Yep. Just take care of it. Yep. As you want to. Yeah. I know. Yeah. That's okay. That's all right. So a couple of announcements, just so everyone in the room's on the same page. If you don't have a book yet, they're on the back table. There's a money bag right there. Make change. Don't make change. It's up to you. All the money from the bag is going to buy more feminine hygiene supplies for the Saluki Food Pantry. So whatever I collect today, I'm going to take it and do that. And anything else that you brought today also, I'm going to add with some other things that I have and take there. So that's what all the money is going for. So thank you very much. There is an additional resource back there. And for those of you watching online, I'm going to post a link to it in case you do want one. Can I have that just for a second so I can show? We're going to just kind of very quickly go over the feasts in the Bible, and this is just an additional resource if you want a little bit more information about that I have used through the years that I like. Thank you, and I'll post a link to that. And then also, if you don't have a name tag or a name tent, I think there are still. Maybe they're all gone. Ooh, does everybody have one? I'll make a few more for next week, okay, in case you don't. So, all right. Did you guys bring a Bible? Yes. Yay! I was just thinking about that a minute ago. I'm like, I didn't bring my hard copy Bible, so I guess I'll be scrounging around for one. We're going to go into the Gospel of John, and we're going to start with John 1, verses 1 through 13. And for those of you watching, especially if you've been watching before, I have additional microphone to help with the amplification of the class discussion, but let me know if how that's working, okay? Because I can hear the rustle. It might be turned up too loud. John 1 through 13 is where we're going to start. Today we're going to ask a couple of questions, and those questions are, who were his own? And when I say his, who do I mean? Jesus. Very good. Always, that's a good try. If you don't know the answer, be brave and say Jesus, right? Yeah. So who were his own and what were they like? So we're just going to talk a little bit about his people, who they were and what they were like, okay? And a couple of things I always like to say is this is a safe place to learn. And we have a lot of different denominations, a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different understandings, a lot of different Bible knowledges in the room. And this is a safe place to learn and ask questions and bring who you are. I have been studying the Bible. I would call myself like a student of the Bible for 20 years. I know nothing. Like I know nothing. Like it is, and every time I study something, I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that was in there, right? I am mostly self-taught, and I am by no means an expert of the history of Israel, okay? I have done probably, I don't even know. I won't even pretend the hours that I've put in to get ready, and I don't say that for any other reason except for it's just so wonderful. Like, it's just really wonderful. I was telling Lisa when we were talking on the phone yesterday, I kind of feel like the last couple of weeks I've spent time in the Holy of Holies as I've just prepared to share with you this morning and over the next few weeks, because God's just really once again opened my heart to how his story connects. And so while like I said when I was praying, we're going to talk about dates and people and history and sequence of times, and I've got a lot of handouts and all that. We're going to just barely scratch the surface. But the one thing, like my goal in teaching it, and I believe that your goal in coming is just to answer the question, so what, right? Like, so what does it matter? And so hopefully throughout this course, we can just answer that a little bit more of this is why it matters in my life. So when we go around a little bit later and have a brief introduction, I'm going to ask just who you are and where you're from and why you're here. What's your so what? What are you hoping to get out of this? So you can think about that as we journey forward. But I'm going to have somebody in John 1 to 13. I'm going to have somebody read it. Actually, I'm going to have a couple of voices read it in your loud preacher voice. We all have one of those, don't we? Yeah. If we have any mothers in here, we have one for sure. And the one thing that I like to know, if you know and if you don't, that's okay. We'll find out together, is what version you're reading from. And so when I stop somebody, I would like for somebody to read in a different version, okay? And the reason I do that is because one of the best ways to get a better feel for what the word is trying to tell us is to read it from a couple of different translations. Because remember, none of the Bible was written in English, right? So everything's a translation. And so how different people translate that, I think, can really bring life and flavor to it. So let's go ahead. We're going to read 13 verses. Who wants to start us off in their best preacher voice and tell us what version of the Bible you're reading from? Crickets.
I volunteer, Harry.
No, that's not. Harry might not want to be volunteered. He does. Okay, all right. What version are you reading from this morning? NIV. Okay, start us off with a few verses. Pause whenever you want to.
The Word became flesh. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light.
Good, and that's verse 9. Somebody pick up 9 and read through 13 and tell us what version you're reading out of.
This is New Living.
Okay.
And I'm starting at
9.
Okay. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, is going to come into the world. But although the world was made through him, the world didn't recognize him when he came. Even in his own land and among his own people, he was not accepted. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn. This is not a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan. This rebirth of God.
Okay. And we're going to focus in on verse 11. And somebody different voice, read verse 11. We're going to have a couple of people read verse 11.
I have a common English
Okay.
Bible. The light came to his own people, and his own people didn't welcome him.
Okay. Somebody else, verse 11.
I have ESV.
Awesome.
He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him.
Yes. Yes. Anybody else? Something slightly different? That's the verse we're going to kind of focus in on. Mine says, he came to his own home, and his own people received him not. And that's a RSV, a Revised Standard. He came to his own home, and his own people received him not. So we're going to kind of ask the question, who were his own people, and what were they like? Okay, that's kind of one of the things that we're going to do throughout the course, all right? If we go to Romans 9, 3 to 5, and I'm going to try to... Romans 9, 3 to 5, and everything's not going to be reading, but we're going to read just a couple of things. Romans is written by who? Paul. And Paul is writing to the church at Rome. Yes, that's where we get these letters, right? And we're going to go into chapter 9, read verse 3, 4, and 5. Just probably one voice this time. Somebody want to read 3, 4, and 5? Okay.
Okay, and it's NIV. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen.
Okay. So who are Paul's kinsmen? Who is he saying he comes from?
Hebrews or Jews.
Yes, right, yes. And who else comes from that group that he's talking about?
Jesus.
Right, yes. And so Jews were Paul's own, yes. And so they were also Christ's own. So these are the people who were his own that we're talking about, right? The ones who did not receive him were Jews, all right? Jews are also sometimes called disciples of Moses, all right? In John 8:39, they call themselves children of Abraham, okay? They call themselves children of Abraham. And so that's who we're going to start with. We're going to start talking about Abraham. Abraham was the first Jew or the first Israelite, not called that in the Bible, but this is where we're going to start, all right? And God established a covenant with Abraham. Abraham is called the father of the nation of Israel, all right? This is kind of where Israel gets started, all right? In chapter 12, there's a genealogy in chapter 11 of Abraham. In chapter 12, God establishes a covenant with Abraham, okay? And this is called an Abrahamic Covenant. If you study covenant very much, there's different parts of different covenants. So some called like an Abrahamic covenant or a Davidic covenant. We'll talk about those things a little bit, which means a covenant between God and this person. But some of it, if you study it more, there are different sections, like in this is the Abraham, or this is part of the Abrahamic covenant. But for the sake of kind of a quick overview, we're going to call this the Abrahamic covenant. And in the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, for those of you who might want to turn there, God promises several things. And maybe some of you know, depending on how much you have studied things like covenant or Genesis or the Old Testament before, what kind of things are promised?
Father of a great nation.
Yes, so there's a thing about descendants in there. There's kind of three primary things that we're going to pull out at least. Descendants is one of them, that you're going to be the father of a great nation. He says, I think at one point, he's like, look into the heavens and count the stars, and they're so numerous, but this will, kind of pale in comparison to your descendants, right? So there's a promise about nation, people. What else is there a promise about?
Make your name great.
Yes, that's not one of the things. Yes, you're right, that I will make your name great. Yeah, I think physically. What else does he promise him? The land. Yes, right. He does promise him blessing. He promises the land, and he promises a seed. And what is the seed? It will come from Isaac. Yes, eventually though, what is the seed that will come?
Redeemer.
Yes, the Messiah, right. Yeah. the Messiah. There's in Genesis 11, it talks a little bit about the descendants or the genealogy, and there's a handout. If you look in your handouts, so there's a handout that's just an overview of today. That's kind of the first thing that's in your book. You might see that there. That might help you if you want to take some notes or whatever. And in the back of your book is just some plain paper that I've put in there because I thought you might want to write a few things down. Yeah, I try to set you up there. Look there, some cute plain lined paper like a student. Yes. And then every week I just have kind of a basic overview of the things that we're going to talk about that's there in your book. But the first handout in your book is a genealogy of Jesus. And you can see kind of right in the top of that dotted box, about a quarter of the way down, maybe a third of the way down, you see where I am, where Abraham is right there. So that's where we're kind of picking up in terms of the genealogy of Jesus. And I don't know if you guys noticed when you're picking up your books about the fancy genealogy of Jesus. For those of you who were in 1 Samuel, I was bragging about my genealogy of Jesus Christ chart that I had purchased, and now I have it hung for you, and you can spend as much time as you want to admiring my purchase, right? It's very intense. For those of you online, I'll take a picture of it and post it. That way you can see it. But it's just, yeah, it's really fun. You can get lost in there. So there's in Genesis 11, it tells us kind of how we get to Abraham from Noah. All right. And at this point, his name is not Abraham. What is his name before God changed? Abram, right. Lot, where there's a lot of that changing names. So we'll kind of use that interchangeably. But he's Abram at this point. But Abram's brothers, he had two brothers, and they were Nahor, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. Okay, we know something about Abram's nephew, Lot, right? And I can write a couple of these things down. I didn't actually plug that in. So Lot is referred to in both Genesis 13 and Genesis 19. And Lot, his nephew, is the father of the Moabitess Ruth. Do you remember that in the book of Ruth and how she comes from Moab? So that Moabite group comes from Lot. And also the Ammonites come from Lot, which we study those sometimes in the Bible too. And in a very twisted story, if you want to read that, I think it's in Genesis 19. Those Lot and Moab, is the Moabites and the Ammonites come from, anybody know? Where do those tribes start between Lot and who? His daughters. Yeah, it's kind of a very odd, I think it's Genesis 19 where you find that story where they are worried that they won't have a line and they get him drunk and sleep with him, and then they have these, yeah, you guys remember, I can just see a few nods, yeah.
And they were from the Moabites, is that what you said?
That's where the Moabites begin, the Moabites and the Ammonites. As we go through this, and I'm talking about these things, if there are more things that you want me to write down, holler at me, okay? And I want to do this the way that we're going to go through a lot. I'm going to do the best I can to point out the things that I think are probably the most significant to you, and then probably just throw in some salt and pepper that maybe aren't as most significant to you. But so in Genesis 12, where we see this covenant, where we see the beginning, Abram is 75 years old, and he leaves Ur and goes into a new land. He's called to leave where he is in Ur, and I found this. You guys will be proud of me. So Ur is like, I know, way over here. Do you guys see that? And then Jerusalem is way over here. That like helps you get like a distance between where.
It's almost like Baghdad or something, isn't it?
I don't. Yeah, you know that's what you guys do to me. It's why I don't like maps. I don't know. I love so bad at geography. Like I'm just so bad. It makes me nervous.
It's in the Tigris Euphrates.
It is very near the Persian Gulf.
Yes.
How's that?
Perfect.
A Tigris. Yeah, I see the Tigris on there. Yeah. And Euphrates. Yes, you're so good. See, now you've just about got yourself a new job being in charge of the maps now when you start asking those questions. So he leaves Ur and goes to Canaan, to Israel. He promises, or he's going to be called that way. God promises Abram to make him a new nation, and through Abram, a seed, the Christ, the Messiah, will come, and all nations will be saved. Okay? So that's kind of the beginning of where his people, right? Jesus' people that rejected him. Not all of them did, but that verse, what does it say? He came to his own, and his own received him not. Is that kind of the way, at least in some Bibles, right? Okay, so that's his own. That's where his own gets started, okay? And Abram has 2 sons. Abraham will have 2 sons. Ishmael is the older son. Ishmael is born, this is me labeling it, born in impatience to hit Sarah. Her name is Sarai earlier in the Bible, but Sarah has a handmaiden named Hagar, Hagar. And that's here, that's her. And Ishmael, so in that culture, Sarah didn't think she was going to have a child, and so she told Abraham, sleep with my handmaiden, and then her child will be our child. Okay. Ishmael is born, and he becomes the father of the Arab nations. And then sometime later, I want to say like maybe 15 years later, don't quote me on that, you might want to look that up. Anybody with like Google handy could look that up, but I think it's like 15 more years-ish that then Isaac is born. Okay, and Isaac is born to Sarah. God will renew the covenant that he made with Abraham, with his son Isaac, and with Jacob. Sometimes you hear people say, or maybe you read in the New Testament, where he says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And that covenant was renewed those 2 times. So Isaac has 2 sons. Esau, and we're not going to go that direction, just so you know, and Jacob. All right, so we're going to move on with Jacob. And again, that's kind of the next one on your main handout right here. How are we doing so far? Doing all right? Guys, I just have to tell you, on week 5, when we do the intertestament period, like I'm already so nervous about that week, because I'm like, there's no way that we can discuss all this stuff, because there's 500 years of silence. I'm just telling you this, between Malachi and John the Baptist, and we have an hour and a half. Okay, I just can't. Oh, that's enough. I guess there's. Okay, so Jacob has 12 sons. The next handout in your book is, it says sons of Jacob / tribes of Israel. See where I am there? Yep. And it's sort of 13 tribes. I mean, it's not really sort of. It is. It's 13 tribes. We always talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. But Joseph gets a double inheritance. And if you want to cite that reference, it's Genesis 35:22. Reuben, if anybody knows this story better, check it out with me. But Reuben sleeps with one of Jacob's concubines, I think, right? Is that right, Sherry? And he removes his inheritance from him, or his what? Is that right? Yeah, look up the story. Reuben doesn't get his inheritance, double inheritance, and it goes to Joseph. So the tribes of Ephraim, right, and Manasseh are actually Joseph's sons, which is still just 12, except for the Levites don't get land. So there's 12 tribes that get land. You following me so far? And the Levites are as a tribe, but they don't have land. And why don't they have land when they?
Priests.
Right. Yes, they do. They take residence in all the lands because they do the worship responsibilities. Yeah. Okay. Anything interesting that you find interesting on the sons of Jacob? I have to ask. Anything worth noting there from Jacob and where his sons come from?
Lots of wives, lots of women.
Lots of women. Yeah, did you guys know that? So you might have known that he had 2 wives, right, that he had sons with, but some of the sons are also from their slaves, right, as in like with Hagar and Sarah. Yeah.
Was it his dad's concubine that he slept with? Wasn't his dad's wife, was it?
I don't remember the story well enough. Look it up. It's Reuben that does it. Yeah.
It was his son's, like his son died, and it was his widow. like his daughter-in-law.
Well, the
Okay.
grandma tricked him.
Yeah.
She
It was a
tricked-
sex scandal. That I remember. That I remember. Somebody look it up, and if you or later, or I can post it later. Yeah, but that's why Reuben doesn't get the double inheritance. Yeah. So Jacob's name also was changed. Anybody know what it was changed to later? Israel, right? Yeah. Did I have that on the handout? Yeah. Okay. Good. Then I go. And the Messiah would come from what tribe?
Judah.
Judah. Right. Yeah. Okay. How are we doing? Right now, we're just getting some facts, right? So Joseph goes to Egypt, right, which is the son of Jacob, and because of a famine, a shortage of food, a lot of the people go to Egypt. It's so interesting. I was just in Chicago when I was there this weekend. We were talking about the Israelites being in Egypt and how the Israelites were shepherds, right? And yet when they went to Egypt, they became brickmakers, and how they multiplied so much and they were brickmakers, and then and then Egypt enslaved them, except they still had their own land and their own houses. And so it's an interesting phenomenon how they went to this, because they were given the land when they first went to Egypt. They were given what land? Do you guys remember? Goshen, right? Very good. And that was kind of the most fertile land there, so that they could raise their sheep there. And then they decided they would make bricks, and I would be curious of why they decided that. But anyway, but they multiply greatly as promised, right? Except for the problem is that they are not their own people. They do not have freedom, right? And so eventually they are released from slavery in Egypt. And who is the man that leads them out of slavery, or at least the main one that we study about, right? Moses. I'm confident he had help. Yes, and so he leads them out of Egypt. And then we're given the covenant of law, okay? So we had the Abrahamic Covenant, which says, you are my people, and you will be blessed, and you will have this land, and your descendants will be many, and from you will come a Messiah, okay? So we have that covenant. Then there's 644 years that pass. The next handout in your worksheet, in your book, is a timeline of biblical history, which is just kind of interesting. I think we might refer to that off and on through the class. But there's 644 years that pass between the Abrahamic Covenant and the covenant of the law. That's a long time, right? Yeah, that's a long time. They spent 430 years in Egypt. All right, and so there's 644 years. And the Jews lived under this law, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, basically. It is the 10 Commandments, and then the other commandments that we're going to read about, some of them in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and how to live, basically. Because it's so interesting when you think about, we read some of the Old Testament, and what is kind of always our sort of Western argument, like none of this applies to us anymore, right? And yeah, I know somebody's laughing about that, right? Yeah, and certainly there are things that have changed, and we don't do them the same. Some people have written some really interesting books of what it would mean to live under this law, like in today's culture. It's kind of fascinating, actually. So there's a whole lot of things that we don't do that way anymore. But when you think about what God was really trying to do, he was creating this radical culture of people and trying to help them understand 2 things, basically, with all these rules and all these things. This is how you're in relationship with me, right? And this is how you're in relationship with other people. And because you've never sort of been taught that before, we're going to go to the very basics, and we're going to kind of talk about it all. But there's 2 things he's trying to establish here. This is how you are in relationship with me. This is how you are in relationship with others. Now, for those of you who have studied with me very long at all, we talk often about when we don't know what to do, we go back to the greatest commandment. What is the greatest commandment? This is how you love me. This is how you love others, okay? There's one of the fascinating thing, and I even just keep saying, so what? So when you look at all the rules of the Jewish people, and we can get bogged down in those, right? So, okay, be honest. How many of you ever started in Genesis and thought, I'm going to read the Bible through? And Genesis has some cool stories, right? And Exodus has some pretty cool stories. And then about halfway through Exodus, when they start building the tabernacle, you're like, what? And then you get to what? Like the Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and then what happens? How's your Bible reading continue? Again, and then how many times are you like, I'm going to start in Genesis and I'm going to read the Bible, right? Like, so because we get into those rules and we're like, wait a second, what does this have to do with me, right? But if we kind of, I like to say zoom in, zoom out, right? So if we zoom out and we try to figure out what is God trying to teach these people with all these rules, and we go back to the understanding of he was removing them from everything that they knew to take them to a different place, and they were just people, just because it was a long time ago. Can you imagine if God sort of, I don't know how many they say there were, a couple million or something, and picked us all up and took us to a new place and says, it's going to be fine. There would probably be some discontent, yes? And so they needed some understanding of this is how you relate to me and who I am, and this is how you relate to other people. So we can get bogged down in all of it, but I think it's fair to say we would need such instruction as well, you know, if everything in our lives had changed like that.
And
So.
they changed dramatically when you think about, they did have their own, they were slaves, but they had their own homes,
Mhm.
they had their own land, if
Mhm.
you would.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden they're in the middle of the desert
And
without anything. I can see there being dissension there.
and needing a very different cultural change.
Very tight.
Yeah.
Because everything that God asked them to do, even in relationship with thinking like slavery and different things that are like, it's not how we do things now, but there was this honoring in those relationships that wasn't present in other cultures. So this was so these instructions, even though they seem to sort of like we can get bogged down in them, they're very radical in terms of loving God and loving others. So, all right, so the law, they worshipped in a tabernacle. There's a picture of that tabernacle in your handouts as well, if you're interested. And when they sinned, they sacrificed, okay? This was one of the key things, that they were responsible to cover their own sins. We see in Leviticus 17 and in Hebrews 9. I don't know if I wrote those down for you, not. Yeah, right here. So they worship in the tabernacle. They sacrifice to cover their sins. There's a couple of references that just talk about the sacrifice. Leviticus 17. Some of this stuff you might want to put in your notes and then look it up later if you want. 17, 9 to 11, Hebrews 9, 22. These things talk about the shedding blood for the redemption of sins. There are 3 major feasts that God set up, which were Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. I think that stuff might be on your main handout, right? Nope. Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. That's what's in that feast of the Bible in more explanation. I teach that class on Jewish feasts and festivals, and so it's really hard for me just to say this and move on because there's so much there, but I'm going to say it and move on. There are several references in the Bible how Jesus celebrated these feasts in the Gospels. So, but we'll see as we study too that these feasts are like anything else. They can be done in a heart attitude, or they can just be done and check the box. Would this be helpful? I'm not going to use this morning. Would you guys like me to take that off? Why? I should look around it. Why does God set up things like feasts, holy days, Sabbaths? For those of you, yes, for those watching online, I'm so aware that glare is on the TV. I don't know what else. I'm going to try again this week, see if I can do anything else. Otherwise, everybody just sits in the dark. That's not good. But these lights on this, in that, it's terrible. So, it's the Sabbath is not for, or holy days, or worship even for that matter, is not for Him. Like we have to do this for Him, check the box, right? It is for us. And God knows how our hearts wander. And so there's this constantness of come back to me, remember me, connect with me. When we celebrate Holy Communion and we go through the consecration of elements or whatever it says, and each time you do this, give thanks and remember me, right? Sometimes if you have an altar table, if you have like more of a high church setting, it'll say on the altar table what's carved in there, this do in remembrance of me. He establishes these things or encourages us in these things so that we remember him. So he instituted these 3 major feasts: Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. Also, there was Deuteronomy 28 is this chapter of blessings and curses. All right, which when you think of blessings and curses, what does that sound a little bit like?
Almost like witchcraft.
It does a little bit, yes. I knew that you would say that, and because I think that too a little bit. But they go back to Deuteronomy 28 all the time in what God promises, and it's over and over again. If you will, then I will. But I would even like to say, if you will, then I can. Because there's one of the things that has been made so clear to me as I've been studying this is that God cannot, I think I put this on one of your handouts, God cannot dwell in a heart that rejects him, right? And I think sometimes we're like, well, I don't reject him. But what if we even take the so what a little farther? What if it's God cannot dwell in the places of our heart that reject him, right? Because none of us, myself included, absolutely, are all in with Jesus, right? There are places that we are continuing to grow. And so he does these blessings and curses, if you will. It's kind of like, if you will, then I can, but if you don't, then I can't, right? And then when I can't, then this kind of thing will happen, all right? And we'll talk about this kind of thing as we get looking at the idol worship and the captivity and all that stuff that's to come for these people. Yeah, go ahead, Donnelly.
I don't mean to play semantics, but
No.
it's more, if I can,
Mm-hmm.
I will.
Yes.
But it should, I think the reverse should be, not that he can't.
No.
He can
Right.
do anything.
Yeah.
I think it's that he won't.
Yes.
If, it's like,
Yes.
if you don't meet me here,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'll wait
Yes.
for you here.
Yeah.
But you've got to come.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There are these things that people say, myself included sometimes, that always make me pause because, of course, God can do whatever, right? And I absolutely acknowledge that. Sometimes we say Jesus needs you to do something or God needs us or something, and I'm like, no, he doesn't. He allows himself, his spirit, to work through us so that things can get done, right? But I think you're right. But there's a place, too, that I think he can't in his righteousness, like in his pure holiness. I can't honor, or I won't honor, right? The decisions that take you this way, bless you, because I honor, or I can bless a life that is obedient to me, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, and so those are in Deuteronomy 28. And Deuteronomy 29:1 says that Deuteronomy 28 is an addition to the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. So these are other things that God gave Moses other than just the law and the 10 Commandments, okay? So there's this interesting fact about Moses, too, that he doesn't actually get to enter the Promised Land, right? When we get that far in the story. Do you remember that story in Numbers 20? Yes, I know. That story always breaks my heart. So there's a water shortage. And God tells, the people are really grumbling. Miriam has just died, and the people are grumbling. And this is one of the times when the people are like, you should have left us in Egypt. We were better off as slaves than bringing us out here to die. I'm paraphrasing. This is the Angie Bauman translation. But it's just very grumbling, and Moses is just over it, I think. And it even says that they kind of have, what is the word in Numbers 20 where it says they have joined against him either? There's this idea of sort of like organized, yes, like we just don't even like him anymore, stuff. And so Moses, I'm sure, is just over it. And God says to Moses, speak to the rock and water will come forth for the people. And instead he yells at them. I think the Hebrew word is marah, which means rebels, and so he takes his staff and he says, listen, you rebels, and he strikes the rock twice, and the water comes rushing out. So, but then God's like, yeah, that's not what I told you to do, so you don't get to go into the land. Isn't that terrible? I think that's terrible. I know. I'm like, that's not. But the thing is, there's this moment. It's such a good leadership story because there's this moment that always, when we take our eyes, when we look at the people, instead of at God, no matter what our job, no matter what our role, we're all in roles, right? And even with your family, whatever. But when we look at the people and try to get what we need from the people, and we don't look at God and try to align our heart with God, then we will respond to the people in our emotion, right? Instead of responding to the people in our God power. Does that make sense? And I think that's that moment for Moses, and it's just so crucial. Like, it changes everything, and so that's in Numbers 20. If you want to read the story more accurately than what I'm retelling it, because that's probably advisable. So, so what else do we need to talk about in that? Let's fill in some holes or anything. I'm going to pause for some questions here for just a minute. What did you write down that you're like, wait a second, what did she say? Or I don't think I knew that, or I have another question about that.
Would you repeat who the Moabites and Ammonites came from?
Yes, let's actually, that is from Lot. Let's look real quick. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick, because I think it might be in Genesis 19. The question was, in case anybody didn't hear about it, about Lot. There. Okay, yeah. Genesis 19:30. The question is, and this is under Abram when we're talking about Lot. Everybody know where I am? Okay. So Abram had two brothers, Nahor and Haran. And Haran, a little earlier in Genesis, seems to have died, maybe early or suddenly, because then Abram's father and Abram kind of take Lot in a little bit, it looks like, because his father has died, and Abram doesn't have a child.
Haran was the
So,
son of Lot, correct?
I'm sorry?
Haran
Haran
had a son named
had a son named Lot. He died, seemingly
Okay,
kind of
it was
young.
his father that actually died.
Yeah, and then Abram and the grandfather kind of take care of Lot. Yeah, and Lot is the one who has a wife that turns to a pillar of salt during the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Do you remember that story? Yeah, okay. And so Genesis 19:30, back up Genesis 19:29. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out in the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. So he dwelt in a cave with his two daughters, and the firstborn said to the younger, this is an uncomfortable story, I'll just tell you. Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine. We will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. And I know we don't understand how that could be, but... And on the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose, lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, and he is the father of the Moabites to this day. And we said, who is the famous, not famous, but I mean Ruth. And Ruth actually will appear in the lineage of Christ, okay? We're actually not going to go that route on the family tree in this, but I'll pause right here. And we're not going to go that way, I don't think. No. And so, yes, Ruth was married to a man named Boaz, right? Good. And they had a son, Obed. Obed had a son, Jesse. Very good. And Jesse had a son, David, who is King David that we talk about, okay? So when you look at the lineage of Christ in Matthew, I believe it's the Matthew lineage, there are 5 women that appear in that lineage. One of them is Ruth, the Moabite. And I say that, I pause and say that because this is one of the so whats. Like, why do we study this stuff? What does it matter? What does it matter that a woman who is born from this kind of relationship, I mean her ancestors, okay, are born from this kind of relationship, ends up in the lineage of Christ? Because who are the people that Christ is coming from? Like, who is the covenant people? Who are the, I'm going to say, right people? Right. Except for who shows up in the story over and over and over again?
Not Jews.
Right. Not Jews. And I think that's so important for us to remember because for a couple of reasons. One, I'm going down this path. One, because sometimes we can get in our comfortable church rightness. Amen? Anybody? Okay? And we can be like, well, we're the right people. And those people are the wrong. I'm sure none of you have ever done that or felt that way. Those are the wrong people. Okay? All right? Well, let's look at the story of Ruth. Let's look at the fact that there are 5 women in the lineage of Christ. 4 of them are Gentiles. All right? All of them have interesting stories, okay? Tamar is the first one. That's in Genesis, maybe 36. Anybody want to do that story real quick? 36 maybe? Somebody tell me if I'm wrong. Tamar and Judah. I'm kind of chasing a rabbit, but this is good stuff because these are the people, right? Okay? These are the people that these stories, and I think it's really interesting because you want to see how these stories are connected, okay? The whole point is when we study something like this, it's very tempting to pull these stories out. Like, who knows the David and Goliath story? Like, most people. Who knows Noah and the ark? Most people. Like, who? Okay, but how do these stories go together to create one continuous story that has some kind of impact for my life, right? Is it 36? 38, sorry. Okay, yeah, close. So Tamar was married to a son of Judah. I can't remember where Tamar was from. Does it say her land, her people? She was married to one of Judah's sons. It's Judah, right? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Because I'm not looking at it. Okay, so correct me. And Judah had 3 sons, at least 3 sons that are in the story. And Judah is one of the sons of look on your Joseph and Jacob tribes of Israel. Where's Judah fall? Number 4, 4th son of Leah. Just looking at that real quick. Tamar was married to a son of Judah who died. In that culture, if the husband died, then the next son married the woman, and their offspring would actually be the first son's offspring. Okay? This was important because of inheritance. All right? So the second son that Judah let Tamar marry, or whatever, died. Okay, and then the younger one wasn't quite old enough to marry yet, the story says. So he sent Tamar back to her home. Now, what does this mean for Tamar? Shame. Yeah, because, right, and no children, and right, yeah. And then time passes, and Judah doesn't send for her to marry the youngest. And then it actually says about the second one that he spilled his seed on the ground. All right, what does that mean? He didn't want to father a child by her, right? I'm not really want a part of this, okay? So then the younger son seemingly maybe is old enough to marry, but he doesn't send for her. And so Tamar, in her, what is the word? Resourcefulness. In her resourcefulness, dresses as a prostitute on a path, on a road that she knows Judah's going to travel, right? And he is interested, and he sleeps with her, and she becomes pregnant. And I think he doesn't have anything to pay her, and so she takes something. So she takes his staff and a seal, okay? And so then she just holds on to those for a little while. And then she goes and visits him and lets her know that she is with child. And, this is an outrage. Yeah, I think they want to stone her and all this stuff. And then she's like, but I have these things. This is the father of my child, sort of thing, and stuff. And so he knows that it was her because he didn't recognize her when she was on the road as a prostitute. Anyway, I say all that because then that's the first woman that's in the lineage of Christ. Okay? All right? And then it's Ruth. No, and then it's Rahab. Rahab is in the lineage of Christ. What do we know about Rahab? She was a prostitute, yes, right? Okay, so there's Rahab, and she was not a Jew, right? And then we have Ruth, okay, who is held up, and all of these women have very wonderful qualities. I'm just going to say, I'm not putting any of them down. I just think it's very interesting that these are the ones that have a place in this line. And for myself, someone who has dealt with issues of trying to deal with shame and not being good enough and all of that, when I see these stories, this is what I do. When I see these stories, I'm like, oh no, this is not the Jesus I love, right? The Jesus I love open arms, welcomes people, redeems every story, has a purpose for everything, or can, you know. And so Ruth, yes, a woman of honor who leaves her hometown and goes with her mother-in-law after her husband and her father-in-law have died, right? And she gleans in the fields, leaving her childless, yes, gleans in the fields to provide for them. And you'll find that story in the book of Ruth. It's just 4 chapters. It's a beautiful story if you haven't read it in a while. Ruth 1 through 4, I think there's just 4. And yes, and then we talked about her family. So she's an outsider, a widow, a foreigner, very much looked down on by that society. And think about that again, because these are the people, right? And who do we look down on in our comfortableness? Okay, we need to always be thinking about that, I think. And then the 4th woman in the lineage of Christ is Bathsheba. What do we know about Bathsheba?
She was very pretty.
She was very pretty. She liked to swim.
She didn't own a bathing suit.
She might not have owned a bathing suit. They're so expensive, right? Yes, and so, yeah, in case you don't, what'd you say?
She was clean.
She was clean. Yes, she was clean. So, in case you don't know that story, right? King David, who should have been at war, I think the story says, right? And he was relaxing on his rooftop and caught the presence, I don't know, the view of a woman who was bathing. And he had good eyesight. He has binoculars. Who is that? And yes, so he sends for her, and she comes to through no, like, people didn't have these decisions, right? The king sends for you and you go. I mean, that's just what, you know, that's like the story of Esther. I always think it's so interesting. They're like, it's a love story. I'm like, no, she was kidnapped and then like put in a brothel, basically. No. So he sends for Bathsheba. She becomes with child. Then to complicate the situation, she's married. And he kills her husband, and then eventually she comes and stays. Anyway, so that's the 4th woman in the lineage. I think it's important to remember these things. The Bible is nothing if it's not messy. There's all kinds of messy stories, and whatever mess your story is, it's like in here. Okay, it's in here. So. Anyway, yeah, so this is how the Moabites, I need to finish this, I'm sorry, because wow, that was a rabbit, but I chased it. So both the daughters of Lot, 1936, I'll finish this out. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son, called him Moab. He's the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son, called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So, and we'll read about the Ammonites too. I mean, I don't think we will in this class, but you read about the Ammonites and those people. So, good question. Thank you. I'm glad that we circled back and did that. Does that answer your question good enough? Yes? Okay. What other kinds of questions or holes just to this point do we need to fill in? Before we go into the promised land. Doing okay? Okay, we're going to keep going then. We're going to talk about Joshua. Joshua, I say this sometimes. Joshua is the first book of the Bible that I studied using an inductive method. I still, I could just cry to tell you how the Lord got a hold of my heart about how much is in his word for me, for us, through the book of Joshua. One of these days I'll teach it again, but it is why my second son is named Joshua. That is the truth. And Joshua 1:9, be strong and courageous. You see that verse sometimes in Josh. He'll say, "That's my verse, Mom." I'm like, I know. So that's fun for us. But anyway, so Joshua, that book and that story just means a ton to me, because it's just how the Lord wooed me into studying. He's just like, let me just show you something. Because I thought when I signed up for the class, then I learned we were going to study Joshua. I'm like, Joshua, what's in there? I don't say that anymore. So Joshua is he's the one that gets to enter Canaan. He takes over leadership of the people, okay, his own, that group of people that we're still talking about. And he enters Canaan, the promised land, crosses the Jordan. And then there's this kind of cool story that between the two mountains that they come into, Mount Ebal and Gerizim, that they read these promises, these blessings and cursings, if you will, the law, and the blessings and cursings. That's in Joshua 8. And there's this, so all along, there's this promise, okay? Think about this with your own life. I'm going to go back and just hit a couple. God promises Abraham that he's going to be blessed, that he's going to have descendants, that he's going to have land. And what's one of the first huge things the huge mistakes that we know about that Abraham does that we talked about already with Hagar, right? We're not waiting for the promise to be manifest, right? To be revealed, unfolded in our lives. Anybody else have trouble with waiting? Yeah, okay, yeah. Sometimes, first of all, we got to know the promises that God has placed in our life. What is a promise that God has placed in our life that we just need to know? Because it's not about land for us, really, right? Yeah. Tell me. Eternal life is certainly a promise, and we lose sight of that sometimes, don't we? Because we try to think that what we're doing here is what matters the most, okay? And we lose track. What? Love. Mm-hmm. That he will never leave us. Yeah. We forget that sometimes, don't we? Because we focus on this instead of this, right? What else does he promise us?
He promised us peace.
Peace. My peace I leave with you. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Rejoice in the Lord always. How can we do that? Because he brings us joy, right? Yeah, so we have these promises. There's this amazing thing in Romans 8:28 that says what? That I will work all things for good according to those who love me and follow my will, like follow my purposes, right? But we forget that when we're just in the mess, right? So I look at Abraham and his life and Sarah, and I'm like, I get that. I get why they decided to break down a door instead of waiting for one to open, because I have done that so many times in my life. People just don't read about it for generations. At least I hope not. All right? At least I hope not. Not yet.
They didn't know what was coming, really.
No.
Like, we read it now and go, well,
Why would you do that, right? Okay, yeah. And so then they get, eventually they get to Egypt, and they're enslaved. And then they get this law. And what's like one of the first things they do after, this is before they get the law, but one of the first things they do after God, what happened in Egypt? Did God show up mightily? Yes. Hello! All the plagues and all the things, and they sent Moses, but even while they were still there, they would argue with Moses and say, we can't do this, and the Passover and the saving of the firstborn, and all. And so, but what do they do when Moses goes up to talk to God and he's away a little while?
Make a calf.
They make an idol, right? And we say, why did you do that?
For 40 days or 30 days or
But as soon as we don't see God or feel God or we walk a little bit away from God, what do? We make an idol, don't we? And what is an idol? For them, it was like, give me your earrings. I'm going to melt them down and make this calf. It was a calf, right?
Yes.
What do?
We find something else that's important.
Yes.
A big house.
Yes.
Extensive jewelry.
Yes.
Fancy wristwatch.
Yes. Or we devote ourselves to our children, which seems fine, right? It doesn't seem, or we get really busy in church work. Anybody? Okay, that seems good. But an idol is anything that we put between us and God. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be. Sometimes it is. But it's anything that takes this space between us and God. And so when we get to this in a little bit, when we move from like Joshua's leadership into this time when the people are growing and they get farther away from God, we're going to scratch our heads and we're going to say, how could they possibly do this? But I think it's always good to ask ourselves, how do we do this, right? Because this is our story. It's their story, and we learn from it, but it's our story. Go ahead, Donalyn. Yeah.
Do you think, it just struck me,
Mm-hmm.
do you think possibly that these things were going on, and we can see how foolish they were in this situation, that situation, and the other situation, and this was all part of God's plan to continue teaching later generations about the appropriateness and about the foolishness of the human?
I think that God uses our mistakes as powerfully as he uses our, successes, right? There's such a value in sharing where we've been and how he met us there. And that's why, I think that's why there's so many messes in the Bible, because then we can see that it's not about the people. I mean, even the people that were anointed and called, most of them, had pretty serious seasons that were dark, right? I was at this conference this past week in Chicago, and the woman that was teaching it, her name's Danielle. She has 3 sons, and they're all big Star Wars fans. But she has this policy in her house or whatever, no bad guys, like on your T-shirts or something. It's only the good guys, right? And so one of her sons, I think the middle one, was getting ready for school, and he had a Darth Vader shirt on. And she was like, oh, no, we don't do bad guys in this house or whatever. And he was like, Mom, I think he's like 9. He's like my Josh's age. He's like, Mom, Darth Vader's a good guy. And she's like, no. And she's so funny because she's like, when a guy comes in and they play music in minor key, that's a bad guy, right? Like that's. And he was like, no. And she said, it took me a little while to remember. Like I started with movie 4. Any Star Wars fans? You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. So I started with movie 4, and in movie 4, it's like that. Scary guy, whatever. But he started in movie 1, and so who did he know? He knew Anakin, right? He knew Anakin, and he said to her, he's like, Darth Vader, he's like, this part was just like a dark season in his life. Because when he was born, he was a good guy, and when he was young, he was a good guy, and then he had this dark season, and when he died, he was a good guy, whatever. And she's like, so it like kind of changed. I let him wear the shirt. I think she said, but I think that's what we get to see. But I think that's what we get to see. I think that's kind of the question you're asking almost. Sometimes God lets us like look at the dark season of someone's life to say, but this isn't the end, because my redemptive power works in these messes, works in these dark seasons, right, to bring about something even, I would argue to say, better on the other side, when we let him. But see, that's the whole thing for all of us, because we can be honest about our mess, and we can let him work in our mess, or we've talked about this before if you've taken my classes, we can put it in a box, right? And we can carry that box around and say, this is my mess, but I'm not going to talk about it, I'm not going to show anybody. And then over the time, that box just gets heavier and heavier. And he keeps trying to work in there, but we gotta let him in. We gotta let him in, so. And I speak from experience. The heavier the box, the longer it takes to want to open it, and then it's just a bigger mess in there because it got spoiled while you carried it around. Just saying, it stinks bad. So, okay, what else? Anything else before we go into, we're doing Joshua? So the big thing about after this time frame, after Joshua and the whole we're conquering the land, but they don't conquer all the land. We're going to see how the generations, at least what's written, is that they increasingly do not know God. They increasingly, a lot of it has to do with the leadership, which is a good lesson for us also. Whose leadership do you sit under? Okay. After Joshua, and this is on your main handout also, kind of like that outline handout, then we go to a period of what? What's next in the, Judges. Yeah, very good. Yeah, we go through a period of about 350 to 400 years of a period of Judges. Any stories from the book of Judges that just pop out? This is not like a quiz really, but anything in that time frame that strikes you as significant? Just wonder what we know. Deborah, yeah, I love that one, of course, because I think so. I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember that for sure, but yeah, Deborah. I love the story in Judges 6 of Gideon. That's one of my favorite stories in the Bible, really, because again, Gideon, the angel appears to Gideon, if you remember, and he says, he says something like, mighty warrior. He calls Gideon a mighty warrior. Gideon's like, yeah, you have the wrong number, right? Yeah, he's like, I am the least in my family, and my family is the least in the weakest tribe of all of, but he uses Gideon, the Lord uses Gideon in a mighty way, and that's Judges 6. That's a really great story. But, so we go through this period of 350 to 400 years of Judges. And then we get to Samuel, which is fun for those of us who just studied 1 Samuel, right? Because Samuel, if you studied that, if you didn't, that's no big deal. He's like the last judge and the first of the prophets, okay? I think I can switch that to, Samuel's the last judge. And then what kind of happens, especially for those of you who just studied with me, we're going to take a major turn here with the people, right? Because we're going to end the period of Judges, and we're going to go to a period of what? Kings, right. And why a king? Why did this happen for these people?
Because everybody else had one.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that they were to the point where God God wasn't visible to them. They wanted someone there that they could see.
Mhm.
They rejected God, basically.
Yes.
Well,
That's
yeah.
what Samuel told them.
Yes.
He hasn't rejected.
Yes, that was like our key verse for those of you who studied Samuel.
Yes.
Maybe is it 8:22?
It is
Was it 8:22? I can't remember.
8:14. I can't
Somebody, yeah, if you, it doesn't, but it says, because Samuel is lamenting because the people are asking for a king. And if that's not the right verse, we can Google it with a couple of keywords. But, and Samuel's lamenting to God, which is exactly what I would do, because I've done everything I could for these people, right? And these people want a king. They don't want Samuel's sons, which is kind of understandable, right? Because his sons were not, you know, although...
They weren't following.
They were
his
rather
footsteps.
corrupt.
Yes, but I think that was more of an excuse than, because it
Yeah.
doesn't seem like they were all that interested in, I don't know. That's just me. But they didn't want Samuel's son. They wanted a king. And Samuel is just brokenhearted. And God says to Samuel, he's like, it's not you that they're rejecting. It's me. Yeah. I don't point to myself, not me. But it's God, right? And so we're going to have to let this be how it's going to be, right? And it's interesting because in Deuteronomy, this is one of the things I'm going to encourage you to read this week, maybe for next week, but I think it's Deuteronomy 17. That early on, God had given this list of like how kings were to behave. So it reminds us that this is no surprise to him that this is how things are going to go, right? So he already gives these rules.
They
But
would read all that
right.
every single day.
Yes. Yes, and I think we'll find that in Deuteronomy 17. And so there's like the kings were to read the law every day. They were to read parts of the law and study every day, and to lead their people from that place, right? Basically saying if a man or a woman in leadership desires to connect with me and follow me, then that will be all he or she needs to be a good leader of the people, right? That's what it all comes down to. And you think about all the ways that we spend our time, and like we know this, right? How many things would be different if everything we did all day long, everything we've done our whole life, flowed from the fact that our priority was worship and study and connection with Jesus? Like basically, if we don't do that in a day, we're not doing anything. Like everything is secondary to that. Anybody living there? Please let me know how you're doing it, because I need to do it. But I see.
Know how they would do that.
I know, but really, I mean, that's what God is. That's how He's instructing us to know this and know me and know it so well. And anything else that happens in your life, that's just great. But this is like our priority. That's why when people talk about, well, you just need to find your purpose or something, I'm like, oh no, you don't. Your purpose is already like that is what our purpose is, to be connected to a holy and living God, and to be empowered through His Spirit to use the gifts that we've been gifted with to bless the world around us, period. That's our purpose. And how that manifests itself in different seasons. Like there's certainly like ministry and outreach and all this stuff that's really great, but none of that is our purpose, because all of that is, even the good things are just worldly, right? I mean, it all fades away, and it all has a beginning and an end. But our purpose is to find and live in and grow in our identity in Jesus Christ. So, okay, all that's free. So Saul was the first king of the people. He was not in power very long until Saul's major issue was not knowing God. I mean, that was the major issue, and deciding I'll do it my way. And really, Saul's major issue, several already, is needing the people to like him. He could not lead from a place of confidence in this relationship, right? And so when things didn't go well in this relationship, he became very threatened and paranoid even, and that really was problematic when David came on the scene, because the people loved David, right? There's this one part in 1 Samuel, where I don't know if it's after he killed Goliath. I think it's after he did something else, and he comes, like there's a parade in the street, right? And they're singing, Saul killed thousands, but David killed 10,000s, and you just want to be like, oh no, shh, don't do that. Like this is going to be real bad trouble for David, and it is. So and Saul just cannot handle that. But he looked like a king. He was tall, like much, taller than most of the people. And the Bible describes him just as like warrior looking. He was kingly looking. And we got to be careful about that, because a lot of times looks can be deceiving. And it says, even when Samuel goes to anoint David as king, this is kind of a verse that probably he says, man looks on appearance, right? But the Lord looks on the heart, right? Yeah, it's always a heart issue. The Bible describes David as a king, or as a man after God's own heart, right? And I don't remember what that, no, okay. We'll go back one then. A man after God's own heart. And why, we know that David wasn't perfect, right? We know enough probably about our Bibles to know that. And if I say things like that and somebody has a question, like, what do you mean he wasn't perfect? Please don't hesitate to ask, because I don't want to assume anyone knows something that you don't know, because we'll pause on anything that we want to. But he made mistakes in his leadership. He made mistakes in his personal life. But he is described as a man after God's own heart. And why do you think that is so?
Well, he listened and he had a repentant heart.
Yes. I think Kathy, that's really... That's the main thing. Because when he messed up, because we are all going to mess up, yes, when he messed up, the Bible tells us stories about the fact that he was repentant, that he went to the Lord. When he was anxious or scared, he went to the Lord. He sought the Lord.
It was a last resort, it seemed like, though. It seems like it was a last resort when he did that. He got to the point where he knew he couldn't handle it himself, so then he went to the Lord.
I think sometimes, sure. I don't think always. It's just because, I think, but certainly there are times when if you read the story with Abigail, and her husband's name started with an N. Somebody remember it? The one that didn't want to Nabor? I don't remember. Anyway.
The one that saved.
Yes, saved her farm or whatever. Yeah, basically. Yeah, that's Abigail. You see that kind of situation with him, and that's in 1 Samuel. If somebody knows, tell me, because it's not coming to me what chapter that is. But there's this moment where this man, I think his name's Nahor, that doesn't sound exactly right, but he won't give David what he wants, and so David just gets so mad, and he's like, well, I'm going to kill I'm going to just basically just take over this whole thing. And so we've seen this, like when Saul was pursuing him, how he would pause and seek God when it was life or death. But when it was pride, it was just like his pride situation. Like, I cannot believe I've looked after this man's shepherds, and now he's not giving me what I want. Now I'm just going to go and take, and that's who we are. Barb, don't you think? I mean, that's that sometimes like that, sometimes in the deepest valleys we will cry out to the Lord the greatest, but in our everyday life we'll go around with our pride. What'd you say, Joyce? Nabal. Oh, yes. N-A-B 25. Okay, yes, thank you. So it's 1 Samuel 25 is where that story is. Abigail and Nabal. N-A-B-A-L, right? Yeah, it's an interesting story. Because it's sort of this like man after God's own heart, always seeking God, and the Psalms are so rich with him crying out to God. But man, he's mad in this story, and he's going to get his revenge, And we're like that. Sometimes it's the little things. I think one of the truest checks in our spirit about how closely connected we are with Jesus and how we're walking with Jesus is how quickly we're offended. This has been a hard lesson for me because I have been someone who it doesn't take much, right? And I'm kind of offended, or even I make up stories and I'm offended about something that probably wasn't even the way that it seemed to be, right? And we build up our response to that, and we carry that offense around us, and then the reaction to that offense shows up in a place that doesn't belong, right? Anybody following me with that? Yeah. And so I think when we can recognize that in ourselves and become, first of all, over time, we can become less easily offended, but also when we can take that offense to the right place and say, just own it, be like, this offends me, or this kind of gets my pride all like riled up, and I don't want to react in this, then we'll avoid that kind of situation that David found himself in that chapter in 25. That's 1 Samuel 25. So there's another handout in your book that is, I think that's the last one for today. And a lot of this, obviously, this is for your reference, because we're not going to unpack all of this, but this is King David's family tree, just for interest. I think my guess is they probably we have the line, this is just for comic's sake. That starts with Michael and Noam, Abigail. You see where I am? And then we get to the other end, plus other wives and concubines, because we don't have room for all that nonsense, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah, it was seems as though he, how did he have time to rule the country if he had all these wives and obviously all these children?
Wasn't the same kind of relational situation that we would. I know. I know. Yeah. Well, they didn't. They weren't in his life the way that we're. Yeah, in his life.
Taking the Bible studies, he wrote the Bible.
So, and this is also, so with David, we have the Davidic covenant. So we talked about the Abrahamic covenant. We talked about the covenant of the law, and we talked about now we're talking about the Davidic covenant, which basically is that the Messiah will sit on his throne, right? David is from the tribe of Judah, and the Messiah will come from the tribe of Judah.
Now, the obvious thing here, though,
Yes.
is that once again, we're not thinking in God's reference. We're thinking the Messiah will sit on the throne. Therefore, the Messiah is a human person, and it'll be this world that will now be
Yes.
this throne.
And
here.
when we get to like lesson 4, maybe if that's is for the Daniel and Malachi prophecies, we will talk about a greater understanding. I think probably if we study the Bible, we know that, right? We know they were looking for a king, but when we look at that Daniel prophecy, it'll help us have a better understanding of exactly why that's what they thought. That one, the Daniel prophecy and the Intertestament period will probably that'll be the ones that like rock our world the most. Because today's a little bit of I think it's like one of those. What is those called? Like zero entry pools. Is that what that's called? Where you kind of get deeper and deeper, right? Yeah. So this is the one where the water's kind of over our feet and it's just lovely, but we're not in over our heads too bad yet. So, but it gets more for me anyway. There were a couple of lessons. I'm like, I'm swimming in this and I can't do it. So, okay. So that's who the people were. We're going to spend the rest of our time. We've got about 15 minutes left. We're looking at what these people were like, and we're just going to look up some scripture references. But before we do that, on the timeline or anything else that we did this morning, do you have any holes or questions? Does that seem fairly clear? There's so much, I know, but I just tried to pull out some key.
They kept good records.
I'm sorry?
They kept good records.
They kept good records. Yes. So
Did they?
go ahead, Kathy. Yeah.
After the kings, it was the prophets, right?
After the prophets, and then after the king. Yes, I'm thinking judges. Yeah, so we go judges and then kings and prophets, basically. Yeah, with some overlap, but yes, yes. And we'll talk more about prophets next time because we'll start with Solomon and we'll go through the captivity when the kingdom divides. So that's what we'll do next time. But so that's kind of who the people were. Okay, where they came from. Now we're going to answer the question, or try to anyway. What were they like? Okay, what were these people like? And we're going to just look up some different scriptures, and I just want to spend some time just reading a little bit about them. And what I'd like to do maybe is just kind of assign a couple. And I know this is the biggest screen that I have for this, so I know probably for some of you in the back it's a little bit small, but it's fine. Okay, good. All right, so can I just give you guys some things to look up? Lisa's still writing. Hope's still writing. So can I start there? Yeah. Okay. So Lisa, you're going to look up. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how they were human and rebellious and arrogant and sinners. Okay, like us. All right, they're kind of like us. And so Lisa's going to look up Romans 3:10 and 11. And Hope, will you do Romans 3:23? And then Mary, would you do Romans 5:12? And you don't have to tell us what version, as we kind of just do this. And then Sue, would you do Isaiah 53:6, and I hope, like goodness, I have the right references. If something really doesn't make sense, you'll know I didn't write it down right. And then Laura, would you look up John, the Gospel of John 8:34? And then Barb, would you look up the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah 17:9? Now, obviously, some of this is not about the people from Abraham to David we've been talking about, because it'll be a little bit later. But just in general, these are some of the character things that the Bible is talking to us about these people. Does that make sense? Kind of what we're looking for here? Okay, so Lisa, everybody know what they're looking up so far? Yeah, okay. So this is the question, kind of like their heart. They were human, rebellious, arrogant sinners like us, okay? Is kind of what we're listening for. So Lisa, Romans 3, 10 and 11.
As the scriptures say, no one is good, not even one. No one has real understanding. No one is seeking God.
Okay.
That's encouraging.
Isn't that encouraging? No one has real understanding. No one is seeking God.
No one is good.
No one is good. Oh, okay.
No understanding. Yeah.
Okay, all right, good. Well, we're all on the same playing field at least, yes. Read us Romans 3:23.
For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Yes. Mary, 5:12.
Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned.
Yes. Okay. Sue, Isaiah 53:6.
We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
Mary Ellen, John 8:34. I skipped Mary Ellen, didn't I? I'm sorry. I'll go back to you. Laura has 8:34. Sorry.
That's okay.
No, you were like mad at me because you're like, she didn't pick me. And no, I don't know. As soon as I did that, I'm like, wait a second, I don't think I gave you one. Okay, Laura, 8:34. I'll get you. Don't you worry.
Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin.
Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. For those of you who have studied James, do you remember that section in James? I can't remember what chapter it is, but it talks about how temptation leads to sin, right? Or is there something else in between? And sin leads to death. Am I leaving something out? Do you remember that kind of progression of, and so those of us who are tempted, and read that again, Laura?
I tell you, Jesus replied,
Yes.
I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin.
Yes, and when you think of death, of course we think like eternal life, not living death, right? But we forget sometimes how death, all those parts of our heart that reject God, and we all have those, and that he doesn't dwell in there, that is like our death right now, right? It's the chains that bind us. We talk about captivity and slavery, and so all of those places, the more that we get to know God and the more we open our heart and the more that he dwells in all of those places, the less captive we are to this world, period. The less captive we are to the world. Barb has Jeremiah 17:9.
But blessed are those who trust in the Lord and have made the Lord their hope and confidence.
And then we have some good news, yay. So blessed are those who trust in the Lord and who make him their hope and confidence. Yeah, okay. I'm going to speed things up. So God gave them, this is who the people were and are, right? And so God gave them the law through Moses. Mary Ellen, go back and look while I talk just a second at Exodus 24:3, if you will. God gave them the law through Moses. And did they keep the law or break the law? Yeah, both, right? Yeah, they kept the law and they broke the law, like we do. And this is a problem of the heart, as we've talked about several times, right? And what does Exodus 24:3 say?
So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said we will do.
Yes. So there's this assembly when Moses tells them the law, right? And what is their response? Oh yeah, there's this song by Darlene Check, it's old, and the lyric says, I said on Sunday how much I want revival, and then by Monday I can't even find my Bible, right? Yeah, and I think about that with these people, right? Because they say that, and they've been released from this captivity, and hands are in the air, and they're like, yes, I will follow you, and then life. Right? And then we're David with Abigail and Nabal, and we're like, oh no, I'll get you, right? And so, yes, we have to know that. Okay, so then he gave them reminders in tassels, and that's Numbers 15:37-41. Joyce, would you be willing to look that up? And while you do that, Jennifer, would you look up the Gospel of John 9:28?
Do you have that on the screen?
Oh, no, do I?
I'm gonna say, I can't remember.
Thank you. So, John, this is Jennifer's. This is Joyce's. And then Ed, if you don't mind, we'll do Luke 24 at the bottom there, if that's okay. So reminders in tassels. Joyce, are you there? Okay. Sorry. They love me. Even
37 through
I give them 4
41.
seconds to look something up. Look it up. Read it.
Okay.
Okay.
You want my numbers?
37 Numbers 15:37 to 41.
And the Lord said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, throughout the generations to come, you must make tassels for the hems of your clothing and attach the tassels at each corner with a blue cord. The tassels will remind you of the commands of the Lord and that you are to obey his commands instead of following your own desires and going your own ways as you are prone to do. The tassels will help you remember that you must obey all my commands and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that I might be your God. I am the Lord your God.
All right. So
that's
this
why
is
they wear the French.
this is a tangible this is a tangible way to remember me. Okay? That's what he gives his people. It's a blessing, right? This is a tangible way. Every time you do this, give thanks and remember me. And so I put that in there because I'm like, what are our tassels? Okay, what are we doing? What has God given us, and what are we doing? The things that God has given us, are we wearing them? Are we doing it so that we are consistently pointed to him? Every time you do this, be thankful and remember me. And also the peoples, they didn't see a connection between Moses and the Messiah. Okay, this is their heritage. Remember me in the tassels and all that. And what does John 9:28 say, Jennifer?
They reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses.
And who are they talking about? Him? Anybody? The answer is Jesus. Right? Yeah. Right? Yeah. It's the answer. Right? Yeah. And so they're saying, no, you might be a disciple. It is Jesus. And that if you look a little farther up, right? They're not talking. They're not talking about John, are they? They're talking about Jesus. I know. I'm sure they are. They're saying you might follow him, but we're disciples of Moses, and we don't see a connection between the Messiah and Moses. Okay. And then the last one Ed has, I think, Luke 24:25 to 27. They were slow of heart to believe or connect what was written by Moses and the prophets.
Jesus said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses, all the prophets, and Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself.
Okay. So there's going to be this, as we move forward, there's going to be this continuation of this promise that's proclaimed to the people that the Messiah is coming. And then when Jesus comes, he's saying, you're not connecting this, right? Because as we're going to see, like through the prophecy and things, they had this other idea of what Jesus was going to be in their life. And so the so what for me, kind of as we're finishing up this morning, is what is the other idea, or what are the other ideas that we have that Jesus needs to be in our life? Where do we not recognize Jesus for who he is? Where do we not connect what the Bible is saying about who he is in our lives because we are slow of heart or foolish or whatever, and we're not seeing him for what he's doing because we think he needs to be or should be or would be doing something else, right? Okay. Good. Yay. We're about out of time. What kind of questions do you have before I pray? If you can, if your schedule allows and you want to stay about 3 or 4 minutes, we'll do a quick kind of introduction around the room. Okay, it won't take very long. We'll just do name and where you're from and that kind of thing. But then we can do that But any other comments? Anybody have a so what this morning? Did you get a so what?
Reminded me of one thing.
Yes.
You know the show PBS, Finding Your Roots?
Finding Your Roots? Yes.
There's an actress they traced her back to Poland. She's
Yes.
a Jewish. And they presented her with a copy of a document.
Yes.
That her grandfather or great-grandfather was a certified descendant of David.
Wow.
And they actually had all the names of this. Everybody.
Interesting. Yeah.
I'm like, whoa.
Yes. Wow. That's some records. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Finding Your Roots.
I like. Yeah. I like that. I think that this is like finding your roots almost, because this is who we are as Christians, and this is where we, our identity is this person. I think that's great. Yeah, it is. So, I'm going to pray for you, and then for those of you who can stay a minute, we'll go around and just do some quick introductions. So, Father, thank you so much for just starting off this way this morning, Lord. Thank you just for some of these very familiar stories, but just a kind of a reminder this morning of how they connect. And I love that the idea of finding our roots, Lord. Because I think as we study even some of the mistakes or the messes of these generations of people and how they missed you, so we can look into our hearts and relate to how we miss you, God. And so I just pray throughout this that this is fun and we can learn and we take notes and we get dates and all that kind of stuff, Lord, but that we continue to ask in our hearts, so what? So what does this mean, the fact that Rahab was a prostitute? Or what does it mean that David messed up? Or what does it mean that his people rejected him? What does that mean for me as I'm wanting to be a follower of you, Lord? So I just pray, God, that you bless us this week and bless our schedule and help us, Lord, just to make time to sit at your feet and connect with you, Lord. And we just lift all this in Jesus' name. Amen. And so I'm not negligent. If anybody's not staying for just a second, next week, if you want, I said it was no homework, and so this is not like, but here's some reading that we will spend some time in talking about these chapters, but we won't be able to read them. Okay? We won't be able to read them in class, and so if you want to just have a little background for some of the stuff that we'll be talking about, it's Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 28, those two, not all of it, John 4, and Hosea 1-3. Okay, so we're going to those things will be kind of significant in our study next week, and if you want to read ahead a little bit and just get familiar with those again, then I encourage you to do so. So thanks for those who are watching. See you next